This isn't about freeing the children. This is about freeing everybody. We need to have everybody participating and contributing to our society on every level as much as they can. The only way that we do that is by facing adultism.
You're listening to The Brendon Marotta Show.
In this episode, I talked to Adam Fletcher, Executive Director of Youth and Educators Succeeding, Executive Director of the Free Child Institute, and the author of Facing Adultism. We talk about the pervasive bias society has towards adults over the needs of children and explore larger social issues like how the identity of adulthood is socially constructed, and give some very practical advice about things that you can do to create greater choice and engagement both for your children and yourself. This is a big topic from which you can learn an entirely new way of thinking about the social issue of how we treat children. Now, here is Adam. When I saw the topic of your book, Adultism, I have to admit I felt jealous because I thought this is such a good way of framing it and talking about the way that we treat children. I was like, I wish I'd thought of this myself. So I guess for people who are not familiar with your work, what is adultism? How would you frame or describe that?
So that's my 2014 book. It's called Facing Adultism. And basically, what that book allowed me to do is really define the conversation. You know, the term adultism actually goes back in the literature to the 1890s.
Wow.
And back then, they talked about it with reference to street urchins who looked like adults. And they called that adultism. But and then in the 70s, it began to mean something else. There was a guy, Fletcher was his last name, who used the term in reference to discrimination against youth. What I've done and what my book was designed to do is kind of redefine the term with a broader understanding to mean bias towards adults. So in this way, adultism is more similar to heterosexism than it is to racism. Adultism is not discrimination against adults. It's bias towards adults, meaning that adults are preferred. Whether it's our ideas, our attitudes, our beliefs, our actions, our knowledge, our abilities, they are preferred. And everything not seen as adult is then ergo discriminated against. But it's first understanding that it's biased towards adults. So the book really defines that and explores that in all of its breadth.
So I know that the objection that you've probably heard before and that most people will sort of immediately reach for when they hear ideas like this is like, well, what's wrong with that? You know, aren't children smaller or somehow less capable? And like, you know, why shouldn't the adults be the center of everything? Just why is that a problem, you know?
Right. For sure. I mean, one of the realities of our society is that it's built on the notion that children are passive recipients of adults' active decision making. So their job is to receive what we give them in the way that we develop it. So we have schools that are created by adults for kids. We have clothing that's made by adults for kids. We have houses that are made by adults for kids. We have society that's made by adults for kids, video games, all consumer goods. All of these things are made by adults for kids. The problem with that, Brendon, is that it is premised on the idea of passivity, that it's sit down, shut up, take whatever I give you. And at best, you'll get that. At worst, you won't get anything. And we have a large segment of our young people in our society in the United States who don't get anything because of that. But even the segment that does get stuff, it's placated, it's pacified. And the whole notion of it is we choke young people with all of these decisions that we've made for them and don't allow them, don't force them, don't encourage them, don't necessitate them to be active in their own lives. So in this way, we perpetuate kind of a consumer model of humanity. Other people produce, you consume. And while that's not inherently in all the way bad all the time in all the places, I don't want to make shirts. That's just not my jam. I want somebody else to make the shirt, and I want to pay them for that shirt. The problem is that there are parts of our lives where every single person has to make decisions. We have to make decisions about when to get up every day. We have to make decisions about whether or not to go to work. We have to make decisions to pay our taxes. We have to make decisions to act right in society, whether that's driving or walking across the street or interacting with our neighbors. We have to consciously make decisions all the time. So, at what point do we go from being passive consumers of society to becoming active members of society? For too long, we pretended like that's some kind of arbitrary number. Well, that happens when you're 16 and you get your driver's license, or that happens when you're 18 and you can vote, or that happens when you're 21 and you can drink alcohol, or that happens when you're 25 and you can get a house loan. Whatever the imaginary number is, it's irrelevant. It's not based in any reality. If anything, what we're trying to do is develop science and research that proves that those numbers are right. But in reality, they're off base, dude. The fact of the matter is, we have 11-year-olds who are fully capable in their conscious judgment of deciding who to vote for in elections. We've seen it in science again and again, and that science has been misconstrued and misunderstood to reinforce, well, kids need to be 18 before they can vote. In a similar way, we have young people who have to wait until they're 15 or 16 to play certain video games. But we know that there are lots of 35-year-olds who they shouldn't be playing those video games, but they do anyway. Well, I have a right to because I'm 35. Great. Young people should have a right to, no matter what their age is, if they can show the ability to do it. So the challenge becomes not necessarily what's the right age, but what's the right ability. And we move towards a meritocracy instead of just this absolute freedom at a specific age that is arbitrary and doesn't really mean anything. There's no foundation for having 18-year-olds being able to vote. There's no developmental science that supports that with any substance. We have books and books of research that show that's an absolutely invalid number. We actually have House legislation in the United States House of Representatives right now that's trying to lower the voting age to 16 federally. We have movements in cities across the United States where young people are being given opportunities to vote. In several small towns in Maryland, they've passed bills to allow young people to vote in local elections. In Massachusetts, there are towns that allow young people to vote for school board members. Who better to vote for school board members? Who is most directly affected by schools? The young people who go to them every single day, but who routinely is subjected to adult decision making without having a voice in those decisions? The young people who go to them every day. So we're flipping the script and we're looking at a different way of being. Adultism is much more pervasive, though, than just those structures, man. It goes all the way across society, back to our homes. I mean, you just mentioned that you're going to become a parent. Parenting is adultist. Now, here comes the rub, Brendon, is that there's a time and place where that's appropriate. We need bias towards adults, right? That is a good thing because adults know when to feed children. Adults know when to put kids to bed. Adults know when to enforce rules for safety and health and well-being. Young people do not necessarily have the judgment that they need to be absolutely in control of their lives all the time. What I'm asking is not for complete liberation of children or anything wild and crazy. What I'm asking for is a reassessment of the roles of young people throughout society, and that we look and see when adultism is necessary and when it is unnecessary. That's all.
So it sounds like the idea of this is to give people choice when they are capable of making choice rather than choice based on an arbitrary age number. Is that an accurate summation of the ideas that you're talking about here?
For all intents and purposes, yes. I mean, the reality is that young people need more opportunities to become active throughout their life, whether that's decision making and choice, whether that is action and outcomes. Young people have to have those opportunities to be significantly involved and really be able to do things that have control over their own lives and control over portions of the world that are relevant to them. You know, in choice theory, they talk about the locus of control. What can you make decisions about that actually affect you? But then what can you make of decisions about that affect other people? I'm saying that young people need to have appropriate opportunities decided both by young people and adults to affect the world around them as well as their own lives. And that is not necessarily defeating adultism. That's why I call my book Facing Adultism. Here's the thing. If the building's burning down, I'm not going to stop and build consensus among the 4-year-olds inside of it on how do we get out. I'm not going to ask for them to raise their hands and decide who should be saved, who should go out the door, who should go out the window, what should we grab, should we get that stuffed animal, should we get those? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to grab them by the scruff of their shirt. I'm going to drag them out of the building because nobody's going to die on my watch in that fire if I can prevent it. That said, the problem is that as adults, we always act like every building is always on fire. Whether it's bedtime for a kid, choosing when to play with their toys, choosing when to turn on their cameras for online school, choosing all these things for kids all the time. When in reality, young people need to have opportunities to make significant decisions for themselves and the world around them as often as possible. And that's how we face adultism rather than defeat it. It's a workable tool instead of something that has to be destroyed, dismantled, and turned over. I'm not talking about the revolution. I'm talking about the evolution, the transformation.
You know what it strikes me is that the part of the thing that the elephant in the room that I see on this discussion is power. Because if you say that the things that children are allowed to do are determined by an arbitrary age, then you as a parent or different institutions in society can then decide how much choice they're going to allow people, because all of the power and all of the choices is theirs to dispense with. So if I as a parent am saying that all the choices are mine, then if I let you make some of the choices, well, then that's me being very generous, but really they're still mine. And if you are charged with taking care of a child, but you don't have the power, then that's really scary if you have the responsibility without the power. So I'm curious if is that something you've seen come up in discussions on this? Is that something that you have a way of addressing? Because I can sense the fear from, but not just myself. Like I'll admit it. There's some of that in myself of like, but if I can't take care of my kids, like what do I do? But I also know that that's what's going to come from other institutions in the world. Of like, well, if we don't get to make the decision, then are we still responsible for it? Like, what happens if something happens to someone? How does that work?
Right. So there are a couple things that are wrapped up in that, Brendon. But let me say first that I have workshopped this topic with more than 500,000 people. I've been doing this work for 20 years. And basically, I'm the executive director of a national nonprofit organization called Youth and Educators Succeeding. And our work focuses on building the skills, abilities, and capacity of young people to change their own lives and change the world. In our programs, we face adultism all of the time, both within our office and with the hundreds of facilitators who we have in the field all the time who are working directly with kids, whether in classrooms or after school programs. These folks face adultism in really challenging ways because it's antithetical to a lot of people's ways of being. If I go to teacher college for 6 years, 4 years for my bachelor's, a couple of years for my master's, and I get all these credentials and I have all this knowledge, and then I go to a classroom and I can't tell kids what to do, when to do it, where to do it, how to do it, who to do it for, why to do it. If I can't do that, I feel undermined, I feel insignificant. But Brendon, why are people becoming teachers if it's only to hold on to power? Power is a tricky thing, dude. I like to say, and there's a quote, and this is this is an ungraceful ripoff of that quote. But I like to say that power is like a candle. When you take two candles, an unlit candle and a lit candle, and you put them together, you don't diminish the light of the lit candle. Instead, you double the light. Power is the same thing. When we share power, we don't diminish our own power. We increase the amount of power that exists. So in this way, I'm not talking about adults ceding power. I'm not talking about adults ceding responsibility or abdicating our roles in society. I'm talking about making more room for more people to have that experience in positive ways that have potential and that possibilities to, again, not only transform their own lives, but to transform the world around them. And I think that that's the real nature of the entire conversation about facing adultism. It isn't necessarily about power and control, but it's about transformation and evolution. Because frankly, we have and let's use the epidemic word. We're into that these days. We have an epidemic of passivity in our society. We have an epidemic of people just being lazy, being apathetic, being irresponsible, and ceding their own personal power as well as their responsibility for the well-being of fellow people and of the earth. And that's where the climate crisis has come from, and that's where schools have been falling apart, and that's where our society is failing. With this role, with this opportunity to face adultism, we could transform the entire picture.
I really like the framing of sharing power and empowering kids, because I feel like that's something that every parent or person who works with children can get behind, is that we do want to empower young people. So when you get a group of people together in the workshops that you've done or the stuff that your nonprofit does who want to empower children and want to empower young people, but maybe don't know how to do that or have the various biases that our culture has still within themselves and haven't really examined this before? How is it that you go through that process of getting them to think differently about how they relate to children and start to make changes that'll help empower them?
So what I do is I work with people to understand these three pillars that support adultism. First, it's to understand a visual, that adultism is the foundation. It's the foundational construct for a building in our society, the building of our society, as it were, the ecology that we have. And on the roof of this society is this concept of adulthood. The foundation is adultism. The roof is adulthood. In between those, there are three pillars that adultism supports. One pillar is culture, which is our group beliefs, ideas, norms, practices that form our culture. They're informal, but they're evident everywhere we look. Another pillar is our personal attitudes. These are our individual ideas and beliefs that we keep inside of us. And then the third pillar is structure, and really the formal components that make up adulthood as a practice. So when we look at culture, attitudes, and structure, we can begin to see, oh my gosh, I fit into each of these. So in our culture, we have our shared beliefs about parenting. We have our shared beliefs about the roles of kids in society. We have our shared beliefs about all of these different things. And when I say kid, Brendon, I'm talking about everybody. I'm talking about birth to 25. I'm talking about all the points in between. This isn't exclusively about teenagers. It's not exclusively about little children. It's about that whole breadth of time span. So this adultism affects children in so many different ways, but they all fit generally into these three categories: our personal attitudes, our shared beliefs and culture, and then our societal structure. Structure includes all the formal parts, whether that's laws and rules and regulations, whether that's activities and outcomes, whether that is our housing mortgage or our bank, whether, all of these formal components, they make up the structure. So parents can see, oh, I reinforce adultism in the structure of my family. I reinforce adultism in the ways that we operate and the things that we do. But they also see, oh, my family reinforces adultism with the things that we share as a belief. Parents lay down the rules, kid follow the rules. Parents lay down the chores, kid does the chores. Parents do this, kids do that. And it becomes this transactional reality. And that's what a lot of our culture is based off of, is transaction. Finally, I help people to see that it's their individual attitudes that are another pillar of adultism. And those attitudes are things that come through in the way that we speak. Whether it's our adages, children should be seen and not heard, or it's my house, you'll follow my rules, things like this. Or it's the things that we don't speak and just the ways that we act. When I design the living room in my house, I'm going to put the furniture in there that I buy for everybody. Whether or not they like it is irrelevant. I'm not going to ask the kids what kind of furniture they want in the living room. I went out and spent $800 on this couch, and I'm going to get the couch that I want to have. That attitude, that personal attitude, is driving adultism. So what I do is help people to understand how those three pillars interact in their own lives, no matter what their position is. Whether that's P for parent, T for taxpayer, E for educator, whether you're a youth worker, whether you're a business owner, all these different people have ways that they reinforce adultism. So I start and I have people focus on those three pillars. My book, Facing Adultism, really addresses them in depth and talks about structural adultism, talks about societal adultism, talks about cultural adultism, personal adultism, and all these different elements in depth. But that's kind of an overview of my approach to talking about it and dealing with it. Once people then identify those, then they can begin to redress them in their own lives. And I do that through a series of different mental models and tools and activities that help people not only stretch their thinking and begin to get into new ideas, but actually examine their own history. Look at their own experience with adultism, both as a person who is biased towards adults and as people who have experienced bias towards adults. Because this is the reality, man, no matter what our age, whether we're talking to a 65-year-old or an 18-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 6-year-old, every person in the age spectrum has both experienced adultism and perpetuated adultism. And that's why I don't talk about defeating or fighting adultism, but instead facing adultism. Because that bias towards adults affects all of us. And I'm not trying to revolutionize society. I'm trying to transform and evolve us into a different way of being.
That was something that came up when I started looking at your work, was my own experiences facing adultism when I was a young person. So when I was really young, I was interested in intellectual things, and I would try to enter adult intellectual spaces and join the conversation when I was like 14. And the attitude a lot of people had towards me was like, oh, like, what's this kid trying to talk about philosophy with us for? And I noticed I still carried some of that even when I'm doing a show like this, of like, oh, well, will they want to talk to me? There's like this sort of that voice in the back of the head's like, well, I'm just a kid. Like, do they actually want to have this conversation with me? And I noticed that experience as a young person had carried into certain feelings and beliefs for me as an adult. So I'm curious, when you talk with people about this, what sort of stuff commonly comes up? What experiences for them that they had when they were young maybe relate to this? Or also, what things do they notice about their current attitudes as an adult?
One of the activities that I use in workshops, so I'll do a lot of professional development workshops for teachers. I do a lot of trainings for community-based nonprofit workers, government workers, different folks who work with and serve young people in a variety of different ways. And one of the activities that I do inside of these workshops actually walks people through a day in their own life in the 9th grade or in the 6th grade, some period that everybody can relate to. And I ask them to remember as much as they can, and what they can't, they can imagine and kind of paint in the lines, as it were. People walk through the entire day, beginning to end, wake up to go to bed. And they go through the experience of eating their breakfast and going to school and the classes that they loved and the classes that they hated, and eating lunch and then going home, and who are their adults in their life after school, and what did they do in the evening, and how did they fall back asleep. And I walk them through that very carefully. The intention of it is to spark that conversation that gets people talking about adultism, not as a concept, not as a theory, but as a practical reality that everybody has faced in the past. Once they do that, in the debriefing and the conversation afterwards, we begin to unpack, oh snap, how am I doing that today? So they name their experiences when they're young, and then they draw correlations with their current life, whether they're a parent or a youth worker or a teacher or whatever. In this way, Brendon, they begin to address and confront their own adultism. And honestly, man, I'm addressing my own adultism still to this day. I've been doing these workshops for more than 20 years. I have a 17-year-old daughter. I live with a couple of young kids. And all of these young people in my life force me to constantly address my adultism, constantly face that reality. And this is the truth. Not a lot of people want to do that. Not a lot of people want to see that they are responsible for their own passive beliefs about adulthood. We just accept it, right? We get the title, you are now an adult, go adult. We've even made a joke about it in the last 20 years. We started calling it adulting. Well, I'm adulting today. I'm paying my bills.
Right.
There's all kinds of hashtag adulting out there. And it's just like, come on, man. Accept your responsibility, be who you are, and let's expand the definition. And the reality is, thanks to your generation, thanks to maybe a little bit of mine, we're expanding this idea of what adulthood is and what adulting is by doing things that we thought were childish, or we were conditioned to believe were childish, and still doing them when we're adults. My toy collection is dope, man. I've got micro machines like nobody does. But that's my adulting getting expanded. I play habitually with my kids. I'm on the floor. I'm doing the things. We are imagining. We are creating. We draw in color all the time because we're expanding that notion of adulting. And the fact of the matter is, there are generations of people who've lived with that repressed belief that adulting equals maturity. Adulting equals grown up. And grown up equals putting away your toys, giving them away, getting rid of them, never looking at them again. Parenting in adulthood means not getting on the floor and playing with the kids, but instead enforcing the rules and being the rule follower. And that's a bunch of crap. That's not real. That's our social conditioning that has led to repressed realities for so many parents. It's no wonder why people aren't getting married anymore. It's no wonder why there's so many single child households. Because adulting, the way that they've always done it, or at least in the last 200 years in Puritan America, has sucked. It sucked. You always got to be the hard liner standing at the top of the living room yelling that everybody must do their chores right now. Nobody wants to do that, man. We want to play. We are an expressive humanity. There are people who are born with songs in their eyes. They've got art in their hands. They've got all of this beautiful ability, but they can't use it because they're so stuck on that conditioning of this is what an adult is, this is what an adult does. And we're breaking that now. And frankly, that's what facing adultism is all about, is transforming the roles of young people, but in turn, transforming the roles of adults. We're not trying to revolutionize, we're trying to transform and evolve. And in this way, make space for more humanity, more ability, more power, not just for kids, but for us as adults too. And that's the ultimate thing that I'm trying to teach and show. This isn't about freeing the children, this is about freeing everybody and really creating an open and liberated space for humanity to shine through.
I really appreciate you bringing in that idea of adulting, because that really reveals that there's a socially constructed definition of what an adult is. And then it sounds like people are told, well, if you want all of these rights and privileges and ability to make choice, you have to fit into this socially constructed role. And I notice in my own generation that the people who talk about adulting on some level unconsciously feel like they're still the person they were when they were young, but now they have this sort of like front of an adult and this role that they have to play that no one ever told them how to play, and no one ever said like, okay, now you've transitioned from one role to another. It strikes me too that a lot of traditional societies have coming of age rituals, and we don't. Ours are just kind of like arbitrary numbers, like congratulations, you can buy a beer now, kid. I'm curious if you think that the distinction, like, do we need to expand those categories, completely deconstruct them? Because I'm just, as we're having this conversation, I'm noticing how socially constructed our ideas about adulthood are. So is there like a complete deconstruction, or is it just changing the definition a bit?
So I don't think that there's a simple answer to that on a couple levels. One is that everybody has to do this work on their own. Now, of course, there's big social things that we can do. We can lower the voting age. We can change the driving limit. We can change school leaving times. We could change all of these things structurally. And that's why I break it down: structures, culture, attitude. Social structures, formal structures, shared culture, and individual attitudes. We get to address all three of these simultaneously. And if we do change all three simultaneously, everything changes. But each person is responsible for starting where they're at and doing what they can do. In systems thinking, there's a great philosopher theorist behind systems thinking. His name is Peter Senge. And Peter Senge says, start anywhere, go everywhere. If you want to change the system, you start anywhere, you go everywhere. I'm going to go ahead and proposition the same thing with facing adultism. Start where you are and do what you can with what you have. And do the best you can with what you have. So if you're a parent and you're in your house, don't worry about changing the whole wide world's voting ages. Simply start in your own house and do what you can at home to face adultism in your own family. If you are a school teacher, if you are a government worker, if you are a youth worker in a nonprofit after school or in the summertime, if you are a politician, if you're a business owner, all of these different folks, whether you're a store clerk or a restaurant server or the head of a Fortune 500 company, all these different folks have ways that they can face adultism. And we all have to start wherever we're at and do what we can. Now, that said, I am looking for a social evolution. This is no small task. But whether or not I'm calling for it, whether or not I'm standing in front of it, here's the other reality, Brendon. It's happening right now. This is underway. This isn't some hypothetical possible scenario. I'm not necessarily naming something that's never existed before. Adultism has always existed, and people have always struggled to face it. In the 1970s, John Lennon wrote a great song called Working Class Hero, where he called out adultism inadvertently. In the 1940s, the National Educators Association, the NEA, and the AASA, the American Association of School Administrators, wrote a 5-point prescription for school democracies that faced adultism head on in 1940. In the 1920s, we had John Dewey, who pretty much invented the whole idea of school needs to be relevant to the lives of children, and we need to make it like it literally was irrelevant in its largest measure before John Dewey in the 1920s in progressive education. But in doing that, Dewey faced adultism and challenged the notion that kids need to be better seen and not heard in schools. So all of this work has been going on for a long time. And whether or not we want to see it, there is an arc of transformation that's been happening for decades and even hundreds of years, centuries. The question is, once we start to see it, you can see how far we've come, and yet you can also see how far we've got to go. And that distance to go goes back to your question and really answers that. Where do we start and what are we doing? And at the end of the day, we're starting in a lot of different places and we're going to a lot of different places, but the entire time we're facing adultism, calling it out for what it is. And that's really what we got to do, whether it's on our individual level, on our family or community level, or on our big social level and across society. We just have to start anywhere, go everywhere.
So change begins wherever you can make change, including in your own life. But if you have the ability to do it in larger institutions, do that too, sounds like.
I'm going to quote Brendon Marotta saying that change begins wherever you can, whether it's in your own life or across your institution.
We'll turn that into a quote meme for sure.
Sweet.
I also, one of the things I notice about this is that a lot of the patterns that you're describing with adultism are things that are really just bad relationship patterns with the justification, well, because you're a kid, tagged on the end. In other words, like the decisions in this relationship are going to be made in relationship to my needs and not your needs because you're a kid. Or this is going to be set up the way that I like it and not the way that you like it because you're a kid. And of course, in any other relationship context, you would think like, that's not a very good relationship. This sounds kind of abusive. But this particular relationship is one that because kids do not have social power, they can't leave. So then it adds a whole other element to that. And it strikes me that there's just a lot of relationship patterns that get justified because of age. Is that an accurate, do you think that's an accurate observation, or is there more to it than that?
That's absolutely accurate. And there's more to it, both. It's not an either or, it's a both and. But let's take a look for just a second, Brendon. Think of the young people who leave the structures of our society that have been set up because you're a kid. Mm. Those young people, remember there was a rash between 2010 and 2020 of teenagers suing their parents for emancipation. It happened in Florida, it happened in Georgia, it happened in Nebraska, it happened in New York State.
I didn't realize there were
young
so
people
many.
Who were literally suing at, oh dude, there was like 20 that happened in 10
Wow.
years. Like 4 or 5 of them became big media, but even the local ones got good splashes. And the fact of the matter is, you had young people who were just pissed. They were upset with their parents. They were upset in the home situations that they had, and they were trying to leave them. And since they weren't allowed to leave by choice, they were trying to force the issue with lawsuits. How did the media treat those young people? Oh my God, demonized isn't the right word. They became alienated. They became separated. They became painted as some kind of belligerent, entitled. One of the favorite words on the internet today to describe young people is entitled. As if being expected, you were expected not to be human when you were young. You were expected to be less than adult. You're expected to be subservient to the whims and designs of adulthood. And that's rampant. That belief is so common, especially among the trolls. And so what we really have to do is begin to recognize, oh, snap, media is painting these young people out to be horrors, as well as popular culture, as well as these trolls in society that are painting out youth who separate to be bad. Think about young people who leave school early. We call them dropouts as if they're falling somewhere automatically. And then we list them as being punks, rebels, rebellious, defiant. And we make their choice to leave school into some kind of a thing that they shouldn't have. In many states, they are entirely eliminating the ability of young people to leave schools before they're 18. They're literally making it illegal for a 14, 16, 17-year-old to be able to leave schools by their own volition. And they're painting out the young people who do that to be belligerent, apathetic, disregarding, and ultimately to be wrong for what they're doing, instead of embracing the reality that not all schools are made for all young people everywhere all the time. That seems like an understatement, but still, young people who choose otherwise, we hold suspect continuously and routinely. It gets a little bit more complex with that when we think about juvenile crime and young people who choose not to conform to society's standards of safety and well-being. When young people decide to use drugs, we paint them out to be ... When young people decide to hold up people and commit more serious crimes, we paint them out to be ... We're not taking responsibility as a society for saying we failed these youth. We're not taking responsibility to say these youth are our future and we're not doing enough to support them. Instead, what we're doing is condemning them, naming them super predators, and locking them up for extended periods of time. There are some states where that's begun to switch, but for the most part, we still have young people who are treated like less than human, less than fully real. We see them as half people, and we treat them that way. And then when they choose to disengage from the adult norms, standards, customs, and traditions of our society, we even hold them more suspect. So you're not rewarded for being human. You're not rewarded for being a full person with their own ideas, beliefs, attitudes, opinions. Instead, you're condemned and held suspect. And that's just the fact of the matter. So I think ultimately your question becomes one of like, what are the outcomes and what are the realities? And it's a bad picture. It doesn't bode well for young people who buck the expectation of we must be biased towards adults. And when we're not, you'll face the consequences.
It strikes me as the other negative relationship pattern that when people try to leave a bad relationship, often the abuser will say things like, well, why are you causing problems in this relationship? But then that also becomes like, why are you causing problems in this family? Or why are you causing problems for this school? Or why are you causing problems for the larger world in some way? As opposed to like, why do you want to leave this relationship? Like, what happened? You know, why is this so bad?
So that gaslighting is very common, and I think you're entirely accurate to call it out and name it what it is. We do have, again, it's almost endemic to the human race, because if you look at it, it's been going on not just for centuries but for millennia.
Yeah.
We have quotes from Aristotle 2,500 years ago smashing young people for not being as good as the previous generation was. And every subsequent generation thinks the one before them is going to hell in a handbasket. It's inevitable. But the irony is, dude, we lose the reality inside of that mythology. The 1930s, there were young people who literally, they were dropping out of school. They couldn't get work. They were just falling to the wayside in society. In the meantime, they were supporting their families. They were scrounging and scraping and making it work, even during the dirty 30s. They were called the lost generation by the media at the time. The lost generation because they were lost to schools. They were lost to the economy. They were lost to their families. And they were seen so negatively and bad. Tom Brokaw rebranded them in the 1990s. He wrote a book about them because that same generation that were teenagers in the 30s became soldiers during World War II. Tom Brokaw wrote the book called The Greatest Generation. How is it the lost generation became the greatest generation? It's all branding. And I'm not trying to be cynical and sarcastic about it, but the media manipulates our views of this all the time. And talk about gaslighting. We think that this is a phenomenon of trolls on Twitter, but in reality, the media is painting out young people in so many ways and really portraying them to be the bad guys in situations where it's actually them being human. It's actually them being full people and recognizing their personal power. Unfortunately, it's done at the expense of the power of adults, or at least we perceive it that way as adults. And so we fight and challenge them. There's a couple words that I want to throw out there just for you to grok, and I think you'll appreciate them. One word is adult centrism, adult centric. When we think about egocentrism, it's the same kind of notion that adults are at the center of every conversation. And that adult centrism drives our media, drives our consumerism, drives our politics, drives our education system. And it really makes adultism endemic throughout our entire social structure. Along with that word is another word, ephebriphobia. Now, this one gets a little bit on the nerdy aspect, but ephebriphobia, simply put, is a fear of youth. And this fear of youth is much more relatable and it's much more observable than adultism even. Because we have a society that has made the fear of youth the standard treatment of young people. So we condition and train young people to doubt themselves and to hold themselves suspect. We condition and train adults who work with them in turn, as well as adults who live with them and raise them, to do the same. So we lock up young people mandatorily for 7 to 8 hours a day in schools. We make parents who don't keep their kids in during curfew criminals. We hold young people suspect who don't conform, fit in, and otherwise maintain the standards of adultism. We hold them in suspect because we are afraid of the power of young people. And we're afraid of young people directly, and that's ephebriphobia. So adultism is driven by ephebriphobia, reinforced with adult centrism. And it forms this nasty arc of reality that every young person faces throughout our society. But let me add a caveat to that. You layer age with identity, and then you really get trouble. Because as a white heterosexual middle-class male, I'll tell you that my adultism that I've experienced ain't nothing compared to the life of the 9-year-old girl in Florida who's an African-American girl who got thrown in the back of a police car, pepper sprayed by police, and locked in the back of that car because she disagreed with a teacher at school.
Wow.
They arrested and pepper sprayed and handcuffed and threw in the back of the police car a 9-year-old girl because she disagreed with teacher. Not because she was being violent, not because she was being belligerent, but because she was a 9-year-old African-American girl. Now, there's another word that comes in because of that. Young people, there are young people in our society who are forced or treated as adults despite their age. And not to the benefit of adults, not to the benefit and the rights of adults, but rather held to the bar, to a higher standard than their peers. This frequently happens to African-American young women, and it's called adultification. And basically, it's raising the standard and expectation that you will not be a child, you will act like an adult starting now. And that adultification is not just the outcome of ephebriphobia, it's also the outcome of white supremacy. And when tied together, it's a crappy reality. This happens to a lot of young people of all races within the foster care and adoption system, where they are expected to be and held to be at a higher standard than their peers. It happens to young people who are high performing in schools. They're expected to be held at a higher standard than their peers. And on and on and on. This adultification is, again, rampant in lots of different social structures as well as cultures and attitudes. So you get these four terms intermingling: adultism, adult centrism, ephebriphobia, adultification. And suddenly our society gets pretty gross because we don't name these things. We aren't drawing them out and we aren't addressing them in our schools that are made to serve kids, in our youth programs that are made to serve kids, in our government funding that is made to support kids, in our families where these children are being raised every single day. We're not addressing this. And this is leading to terrible outcomes that are not faced. It has for more than a century, and it will continue to be as long as we aren't facing adultism.
That's a lot. And there's so much interesting stuff in there that I want to ask about. I'll start with adultification. When do you think adultification occurs? Because I noticed there's infantilization when we treat young people. Go ahead.
You've got it. You're putting together the formula. So we have an entire spectrum, and really it's about overlapping factors that inform this behavior. So adultism is a phenomenon that all young people experience, that all adults experience, regardless of our age, social class, socioeconomic status, race, gender, culture, sexual orientation, anything. This adultism is pervasive. It's in every sector of our society. It does all the things. Adult centrism is similar in the sense that all of our society, all of the structures of our society, all of the attitudes, all the cultures in our society are centered on adulthood and that experience of adults. Whether those are formal, whether those are informal, whether they are individual, whether they are group, they're all centered on adults. So adultism is common, adult centrism is common. Infantilization, treating young people as if they are less than their age. This happens in all age categories. This happens in all different identities throughout our society. It's much more common among the middle class and upper middle class to assume that young people do not have the power and potential that they could have, that they should have, only because, not of their age, but because of their so-called and supposed ability or capacity. This is infantilization is oftentimes footed in developmental theory, child development, youth development, and adult development is predicated on infantilization. You will act this way at this age in order to show these things. The dilemma of that stair-step kind of approach to seeing human development is that that is all theoretical and has continually been disproven by science. They have tried to use brain research to reinforce these notions of development, but when it's deconstructed and looked at critically, it all falls apart. There's a great book called Teen 1.0 by a guy whose last name is Epstein, and this book takes apart these notions of brain development. There's another author, his name is Mike Males. He's a sociologist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he takes apart this mythology, this brain science. And these authors, these psychologists and sociologists, really look at the statistics in depth and demonstrate that our society is predicated on adult centrism. So we have adultism, we have adult centrism, we have infantilization, all happening across the spectrum. But when they're layered with race, when they're layered with socioeconomic status, when they're layered with identity of any kind, words like ephebriphobia start to get really loud, because the fear of youth is predicated on their age, but it's also predicated on their socioeconomic status. If a young person is 17 but looks similar to you and I in terms of looking like a white male, maybe being heterosexual, maybe being middle class, maybe having education, then they're less likely to experience ephebriphobia than a young person who does not look like you and I, particularly if they're BIPOC, if they're identify as Black, indigenous, person of color of any kind. Then they are more likely to experience, if they identify that way, then they're more likely to experience ephebriphobia loudly. When we look at other phenomenon on top of that, it even becomes more heinous in terms of that age-based discrimination and bias. But all of those factors play together and really begin to become evident when we look at statistics coming from law enforcement. They become evident when we look at statistics coming from the education system, from public health, and on and on and on. All of these biases stack up with adultism as kind of the frosting on the cake of oppression, as it were. Because in a sense, I mean, Brendon, at the end of the day, adultism makes the rest of it okay. When you were a baby, you didn't get a chance to go back and rest for the rest of the day because mom had to get to work and dad had to do the things or whatever your circumstance was. But to an extent, and again, when we face adultism, we see even the experience of being a baby in our society is predicated on bias towards adults. A mother can only do what a mother can do. She can't do everything all the time. Of course. And I love mothers for doing the hard work that they do, and their experience is predicated on adultism. Same thing with the teacher, same thing with the youth worker, same thing with the librarian, same thing with the government official. All of these folks have adultism at the middle of their lives.
So I actually want to learn more about that, because, like I mentioned earlier, me and my wife are having a baby in August. So how is the experience of infants and babies, how does adultism factor into that?
So again, if we look at adultism as bias towards adult, and we think about the experience of a baby, of an infant, we can see how our entire understanding and everything that we do with that young person is first predicated on what we know and what we don't know. When we know to do this, then we get that. So there is, in infant relations, there's a theory called attachment theory. And attachment theory proposes that young people who are able to have their attachment needs met when they are young form healthier bonds to not only their parents, but their peers, their siblings, and their larger communities as they get older. Now, I'm not 100% a proponent of attachment theory across the board. Some of it goes way too far out, way too quickly. But the reality that when a young baby cries, they are asking for something with that behavior. That is a beautiful understanding that defeats adultism, because it moves beyond our bias and starts to acknowledge that baby has needs, and we can listen to that baby to help us understand what those needs are. Now, the scream, I've sat in the room with the 7-week-old who's screaming their head off at 3 a.m. in the morning, and I was too tired to think about, what does this baby need and how do I figure that out? But I had the presence of mind and the ability, because of my work to face adultism, to hold that baby and listen to its cues. Their behavior was their words. So the crying meant they needed something. Whether that was more holding, whether that was a fresh diaper, whether that was food. As a parent, my job was to listen to what they were saying and discern what it meant. To some extent, that's our job always as parents. But I'll tell you this, man, my 17-year-old daughter, she is so much more capable of telling me what she needs today than she was when she was 7 months old. But she is that way because when she was 7 months old, she was heard. And she had this lifetime of experience to the point when she was 17. And now she doesn't wait to be asked. She doesn't wait to be asked what she needs. She volunteers it all on her own in healthy and appropriate ways that allow me as a parent to meet her where she's at, instead of me insisting, you come to me the way that I want you to, and I say the things that I want you to say. And in that way, our relationship is different as father and daughter, as father and child, because we've transformed, we faced adultism together, and we've transformed that relationship in a healthy and whole way. Every parent can do the same. Not easy, not fast, but with intention and purpose.
I totally agree on that, on listening to what children are communicating, even from day one. One of the things that I love about my wife is that while she's been pregnant, I'll sometimes hear her in the kitchen talking to the baby in her womb and just tuning into her own body. Like, what does the baby want to eat today? So even from like before birth, like, okay, like I'm going to listen and see not just what I feel like eating right now, but like, what is my body? What is the person in my body trying to signal?
Right.
I also noticed too, I want to ask about some of the brain science stuff that you mentioned, because one of the earlier episodes I did was with someone who is a historian who'd written about the history of human rights. And in her work, she talked about how anytime that there's a movement for human rights or for greater equality, there's often a pushback that says, well, you know, it's okay to have less equality because this other group is different in some way. And I've seen some of those articles talking about brain development. Some of them even saying things like, oh, well, our brains are still developing when we're 25, so maybe we should roll back these rights even further, which, of course, all those articles came out as the millennials were coming of age. You know, I'm sure there's no coincidence there. But I'm curious, what is the debunking of that science that you mentioned? Because I've never read this stuff, you know, debating it or proposing an alternate theory.
Right. Well, you know, to be honest with you, I can't really propose a lot in that way. I don't necessarily study it too closely myself. But what I do know is that rather than understanding brain science, so one of the dilemmas of brain science is a lot of it is predicated on this notion of stair-step development. That you begin here, you go there, and that there are obvious and clear notions along the way that everybody needs to achieve in order to be bing. The turkey is cooked.
It's
now
linear.
Take it out of the oven and go live life. It's very linear, and it very much is necessitated and obligated to conform to Eurocentric beliefs. That's just the way it goes, man. And because of that, we need to change the way that we understand brain development from its premise. Instead of being a stair-step linear process, brain development actually acts like a web or like a spiral. Different young people, different human beings have different perspectives on different things all of the time, no matter what their, quote, brain development looks like. This is true of people who are differently able, whether it's cognitive or emotional or social, as well as different people who are at different levels of so-called and supposed maturity in terms of their age or their life experience. We have different perspectives and we do different things. So from that place, we take it out of that linear perspective and allow it to become less of a straight line and more of a swirl. And we see that those different perspectives aren't just reality, they're actually viable alternatives. Without getting too far into it, there is a Eurocentric kind of supposition behind brain development as we understand today. That linear notion, that idea that it goes from here to there in a way that is concrete and predictable. We need to break that Eurocentrism and get towards this kind of multifaceted knowledge. Because the fact of the matter is, when even with the brain not fully developed, young people have different different viable perspectives that we have to take in. And when we're not doing that, when we're negating those, we're taking away their ability to contribute. And going back to my original premise, we need to have everybody participating and contributing to our society on every level as much as they can. The only way that we do that is by facing adultism, including breaking down those mental models that frankly have been damning, belittling, and otherwise incapacitating for generations.
I appreciate you bringing in the intersectionality of this issue, because it sounds like with the brain development research, there's a lot of ways that intersects with the issue of neurodiversity, and that model assumes a very specific type of neurotypical thinking, and someone who is, say, not very mathematically gifted but is incredibly musically gifted would show up as underdeveloped on that, and someone who's neurodiverse in some way or autistic would, again, like not quite fit into that model. And it sounds like, too, a lot of this comes back to that we have socially constructed expectations for people from different groups. And so if we have a socially constructed expectation for teen and then a socially constructed expectation for Black, then like Black teen creates a new social construction that might be completely wrong or have all sorts of weird biases in it. And so I'm curious, what is the way to deconstruct those expectations or biases in ourselves and then in the larger world around us? Because it sounds like they get a little complex when you start putting two of them together.
Right. Well, and imagine, again, just like you just said, imagine taking, instead of 2, put 10 together.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is that it becomes, a very complex web. It's a complex reality. One of the issues, Brendon, is that we have proceeded, the way that our consumer society has relied on it, we've proceeded to simplify and oversimplify every decision-making opportunity in a person's life, to where a lot of us do not have the capacity anymore. Actually, let me say that differently. A lot of us don't have the desire anymore to see the complexities of daily living. We're faced with these multiple oppressions, and we can only address one at a time. In his last book that was published posthumously after he was murdered, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King wrote a book called Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And in his book in 1969, after he was murdered, Dr. King proposed that the movement that he was in the front of, that he was informing, that he was advocating for, was at a point of separation. And that separation looked like chaos, in that everybody was identifying in certain ways that allowed them to identify against other intersecting phenomena. And the choice that he said that we were faced with in 1969 was, where do we go from here? Do we choose chaos and that lack of intersectionality, or do we choose community where we could see clearly who we are, but also how we fit together with others who are involved in the struggle? The struggle ultimately is not a struggle against age bias. It's not a struggle against overt discrimination of any specific form. It's a struggle against every form of overt discrimination. It's not one or the other, it's all and. And from that alone, we get a place of understanding the different biases and discriminations that we all face, no matter what our identities. There's a bias in our society against males. This bias disallows males to break out of gender conformity and to have an understanding of themselves as a whole human. Instead, it segregates us and disallows us from non-binary, non-popular understandings of what males are, what males do. That's as males. There's a bias against women for the similar reasons in terms of gender conformity and expectations. There's a bias against all of these different identities. And where we are in a society today, so much chaos, because all of those identities are competing for their place at the fountain of freedom, at the fountain of solidarity. At the fountain of freedom. They're competing for their place at the fountain of justice, and they believe it's us versus them, and them. When in reality, we have, and again, Dr. King talked about this inexplicable matrix of interconnectedness. And he talked about interconnectedness so fully, so commonly. He had this beautiful analogy where he talked about how every one of us is beholden to people around the world every single time we walk out of the front door of our house. That was in 1969, man. Could you imagine how much more beholden we are today? Because of globalism, because of globalization, and the realities that this thing is tied together in impeccable knots. They're perfect Gregorian knots of where you pull on one end, you get a reaction at the other end. It's the butterfly effect to the extreme. So one of the things that I end up teaching about is what I call personal engagement. And it's to help people to understand all of the ways that we are inextricably engaged with the world, whether or not we recognize that. It's helping people to see we're in this, again, web of mutual interdependence. And how when you pull on that one string in our own lives, Brendon, when you pull on the string that connected you and I, you affected somebody on the other side of the planet in a way that you and I will have a really hard time to name. And that happens every single day in every single way. There's a wonderful sociologist, his name is Robert Putnam. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And Bowling Alone proposes that the breakdown of American society today was because we have an absence of the circulation of social capital. Social capital is this invisible exchange that we all make all the time, where we exchange greetings and relationships and interactions for the value of those relationships and interactions. And social capital puts a name to that exchange. So with the absence of the exchange of social capital, our society is crumbling. And Putnam lays it out so beautifully and succinctly. I don't know if I go so far to say that our society is crumbling, but I could say that that lack of understanding, that when Brendon and Adam talk on a podcast on the internet one day in May, that's affecting the person on the other side of the planet. That lack of understanding is disallowing us to feel engaged with the world. And the challenge becomes, how does every single person see our mutual interdependence?
It strikes me that there is, you mentioned Dr. Martin Luther King's last posthumous book, and it's suggesting that rather than competing with each other for social equity or power or rights, that we would work together. And I really like that, and I like that framing that you have in your own work of that it's something we're working together on. And it sounds like the challenge that we have now is that we're actually more connected than ever before, but perceive that connection less. And I'm wondering how you think we can create that connection, or become aware, I guess, of the connection that's already there and the ways that we're affecting people. Because that's been a theme across these interviews.
This is why, right? So this is why I talk about engagement. So people make engagement out to be some kind of a mythical thing. Oh, all we need to do is engage. But they talk about it in terms of like emotional engagement. Oh, I need emotional engagement. I need to feel about the things that I do. Or they talk about intellectual engagement. Oh, I need to think hard about the things I need to do. Or they talk about it as spiritual engagement. Or they talk about it as cultural engagement. And all these different forms of engagement. This is why I talk about personal engagement. Because before we try to connect to the world around us, we need to figure out what is going on in the world within us. That goes back to Gandhi. Be the change you wish to see in the world. If you want to engage with the world, and if you want the world to become engaged, engage in yourself and be the change you wish to see in the world. So I work with people, again, in workshops and all these different circumstances. I work with people to help them understand the connections that they have in their own lives. And I believe that is the core of this work. Brendon, it's recognizing and naming that interconnectedness. Again, the mythology of Twitter is that we're just a hashtag. Man, you're just a hashtag. Hashtag Black Lives Matters. Hashtag Arab Spring. Hashtag identity. And all of that is valid, but there's so much more to us than those hashtags. There's more to us than those identities. And as Dr. King was saying, there's more to us than just the chaos. There is a community among all of us. And I believe that we have to start by drawing out and naming what that community within us is. And then when we see the community within us, that engagement within us, we could see the community around us and that engagement in the world that we live in. And when we do that, we begin to defeat that separation. We begin to defeat that chaos. And we begin to draw together the hope of community. Oh, that's the power place to go to. Because again, it's not diminishing the candle. it's making brighter light for everybody to share. It's not diminishing the power, it's making more power for everybody to share. That's powerful, man.
I think that's a good note to finish on. Is there anything else that you want to add before we wrap up? Anything that I didn't ask about that you wish I had? Anything? I'm sure I feel like I could talk about this for as long as you've got time, but I know that we're coming up on an hour here.
Well, I will say this. I mean, to draw it full circle, adultism is that bias towards adults. Engagement is the connection that we have to the world within us and around us. And it's choosing the same things over and over. So we are engaged in adultism right now. Let's just acknowledge that. Let's start with that place of accepting the reality that we're all part of and work from that space in order to create the change. Because at the end of the day, man, I'm not again and again and again, not trying to start a revolution, just trying to help the evolution along, make the transformation real, and give everybody an opportunity to contribute. From that place, everything changes. So thanks for having me. It's just fun to talk about, Brendon.
If someone hears this podcast and wants to support the work that you do or get involved in some way, where should they go?
Well, there's a couple of resources that I have online waiting for people. I run a program through my nonprofit. The program is called the Free Child Institute for Young People and Social Change. And I have a dozen articles, actually a couple dozen articles all about adultism on that website, waiting for anybody who wants to read more, but also lots of ways that people can interact and get involved in supporting young people to really create change. But ultimately, I would love to point people to yesk12.org. Yesk12.org is the online home of my nonprofit called Youth and Educators Succeeding. We have a series of programs. It's all focused on youth engagement in all these different issues, schools, careers, community building, the whole 9 yards. And so I'd really love people to go and check out yesk12.org, make a donation, send an email, get involved, do whatever you can. But at the end of the day, Brendon, let's go back to the book that you mentioned at the beginning, Facing Adultism. It's right on Amazon. Just go in and search that and start your own knowledge building around what adultism is, what it does, and what difference it can make. There it is. So that's where I'd send people.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for having the conversation with me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. Take care, man.
Thank you for listening to the Brendon Marotta Show. If you liked this episode, please share it with someone else who would also like it, and then go on whatever platform you listen to the show on and leave a positive review. If you want to support the show directly, go to brendonmarotta.com/show and subscribe there. Paid subscribers get special unreleased bonus material and live events that are only available to them. Once again, that is brendonmarotta.com/show. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you all later.